Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is John Haley, and I'm joined here by my colleague Simon Conradi. Simon and I are going to be talking about the 7 habits of successful delivery performance today, and we really think there's some pretty good information ahead. If any of you have attended our recent Managing Unpredictable Demand webinar, there'll be a little overlap today, and the topics are certainly related. However, there's a wealth of new content as well, so there should be plenty of fresh information here. Before we head into the webinar proper, I'd like to let you all know that today's session is targeted at a little under an hour of content, followed by an open question session at the end. As a result, we're going to be encouraging you, or we encourage you to submit questions throughout the webinar, and some will be answered immediately, others we'll address over the course of the presentation anyway, and anything that's open at the end we'll be trying to address at the end. Should time prevent us from getting to all the questions, then either Simon or myself will respond offline via email or whatever to any questions that are open. So please fire the questions in. We definitely welcome them. So on to today's agenda. Naturally enough, we're going to begin with a look at DIFOT as a concept, what it stands for, what it means in a more practical sense, and why it represents something of a holy grail to a lot of businesses out there. I think the second section of today gives a pretty fair indication to one of our main points of emphasis, and that is that DIFOT's really the responsibility of the whole business and not simply the warehouse, as is very often the case, that it gets pinned as a warehouse problem. And from there, whilst we don't think that DIFOT's just a warehouse problem, it is of course definitely a question that pushes and extends out into the warehouse, so we're going to be looking at some of the tools available to drive performance in that part of the business. Finally, we're going to be taking a quick look at some of the important metrics to track within your business if DIFOT's something that you want to make a priority and something that you want to get a real grasp on. As any of you who have attended previous Syspro webinars will know, we like to take the pulse of our audience from time to time by putting up poll questions. These tend to be pretty straightforward questions that just relate to the topic at hand and help us to understand what our clients are thinking or doing, or what you, the audience, are thinking about what we're putting forward. Sometimes the results go exactly as we expect, and sometimes they're quite surprising. So over the course of today, you'll see a few of those. And I guess on to today's presentation proper. And we're going to start with, as I said, what is DIFOT? Why is it so hard to provide? So DIFOT, delivery in full on time, it's one of the most common ways that businesses measure service performance. It's known by a variety of other similar names, on time in full or OTIF, and it's a measurement that, as I've sort of intimated already, it's often pinned primarily or exclusively as a responsibility for the warehouse, and it's really not entirely fair in most cases. I myself actually once worked with a client who took that exact rule. They made DIFOT the #1 KPI for their warehouse manager. And unfortunately for this guy, the business was also into 2 sites that were close but physically discrete. One was admin, sales and manufacturing, and one was the warehouse. And since this guy had to hit DIFOT targets, the poor warehouse manager, he was telling me that he spent probably more time away from the warehouse over at the other site, chasing the sales team, chasing the production orders, more time there than he did at the warehouse. And this guy's fingernails, they spoke a very eloquent tale of a man responsible for delivering on other people's promises and mistakes. There's another measure which is related to DIFOT, but probably more stringent, and that's POF. Perfect order fulfillment, POF. It's defined on the Supply Chain Excellence site as perfect order fulfillment is a discrete measurement defined as the percentage of orders that are A, delivered on time and in full to request date or the commit date, B, that meet the customer's 3-way matching, so their invoice versus PO versus receipt, and that have no product quality issues. Perfect order fulfillment, it's also frequently used to measure supplier delivery performance and manufacturing schedule attainment. In those cases, you substitute purchase order or manufacturing order for customer order, of course. But it's essentially a more demanding and really a more rounded view of DIFOT, and it covers more areas, particularly around the question of quality. So I guess at this point I'll invite Simon to join into the discussion and to talk in some detail about why it is that DIFOT is so very hard to actually achieve. why it is that DIFOT is so hard to achieve.
Thank you, John. Can you hear me fine?
Absolutely.
Good. Yes, it is very difficult to achieve because, as I think you alluded to, DIFOT is not something that lives on its own. It's something that is dependent upon really all areas of the supply chain working correctly and being visible both up and down the supply chain. So what we're looking at here is a simple graphic of the supply chain. Right on the right-hand side is the customer. And that customer, in this instance, but not always the case, is getting goods from a retail store. In order to have those goods, supply those goods to the customer within the time that the customer expects. Generally, that retail store has to hold inventory. This is not always the case, but this may be the case. And in order to achieve that service, there are a number of parameters that come in besides the inventory. And they're shown by those little graphics there. There's the lead time, indicated by the hourglass. There's a lot size, which is indicated by the little pallet with goods on. And then the smiling face, hopefully it's a smiling face, is an indication of service level. So these variables are some of the things that come into the DIFOT calculation as well, and that need to be tracked and managed and visible to those who are within the supply chain. In the same way as the end customer is a customer of the retail store is a customer of the distribution center. The same variables then will apply there and move on down the chain. And very often for the person supplying the end customer, the more visibility there is down the chain, and you're going to look at some technologies later that assist with this, it's easier then to provide the customer with a reliable data delivery that then you can meet and maintain. And so this is why, in this case, inventory is a very important part of the whole DIFOT equation, but as you alluded to earlier, it's not the only part. Let's look at some other variables that might apply on the next slide. So here we have the same supply chain, but now at the bottom there you'll see there's a graphic. This is the graphic of perceived demand, and this is one of the reasons why DIFOT can be so difficult to achieve. At the customer end, the demand is very stable. The graph indicates, that little orange graph indicates that it's very stable demand from one period to the next. However, due to the interaction of lead time and lot size and other variables within the supply chain, by the time we get to the distribution center, that demand is getting more lumpy. And as we go down the supply chain, it gets more and more lumpy due to the interaction of those variables, lot size, lead time, and inventory. And this can make very small changes in customer demand translate through the supply chain into very big variations in demand further down the supply chain, which is an effect known as the bullwhip effect, which is very familiar to those in supply chain. And this can make a huge impact on the way that supply chain performs, and so it has to be monitored and controlled very carefully. And again, it's an issue of visibility and information being visible up and down the supply chain. So let's look at the next slide now. So what are the additional challenges to matching service with stock? Some of them are very difficult to control, like sudden changes in the economy. The famous financial crash of 2008 comes to mind there, but there are others. Technology changes can have a huge impact. We see that in the areas like the computer market or the cell phone market can have a huge impact on our ability to match the demand that's occurring with supply. Complex demand patterns, we'll look at a couple of examples of that. They can have an impact, but with the right approach and the right systems, the right people, the right technology underlying it, these can be managed and dealt with, provided you can identify them and deal with them. And then one of the ones that's more difficult is erratic demand, which, as it says on the slide, is characterized by infrequent hits or demands and variable demand sizes. This is something that a larger number of stock codes are displaying this kind of behavior today as the tail of how many stock codes suppliers are expected to hold gets larger and larger. And the reasons why we might have erratic demand can be quite complex, but we can have often very good technologies and approaches to manage them more effectively throughout the supply chain. So let's now have a look at the next set of, the next slide, which gives us an understanding of why we have inventory in the first place. As we said, inventory is a key component because ultimately the decisions that we make around supply chain, whether good or bad, land up in inventory, either too little inventory or too much inventory. So it's good to understand why inventory exists in the first place. And the fundamental reason why we have inventory, as the graphic at the bottom shows, is that inventory is there to balance variations in demand and variations in supply. If we knew exactly when a demand was going to occur and we could predict our supply exactly, we could match those two up like a cross-stocking operation and not have to hold any inventory. But it's very difficult to get those two things right, and so the uncertainties on the demand side and uncertainties on the supply side are the primary reason why we hold inventory, but there are a host of other reasons, like lead time greater than service time, demand and supply quantities not equal, limitations on order frequency, like you'd like to order every day, but you have to order once a month or once in 3 months. All of those things lead to holding more inventory in order to give the kind of service that our customers would expect. Let's now have a look at some of the variables that we've got which lead to the calculation of DIFOT or OTIF. And all of these illustrate the complexity of the problem and how this has to be a collaborative approach, because nobody in one area of the business is responsible, can be responsible for all of these variables. On the demand side, we've got a target service level. That's the service level that our customers would expect of us, or that we undertake or need to undertake to be competitive in the industry. In order to achieve that, we often need to have a very good demand forecast. We need to manage our demand and understood the demand very well, and measure that against the actual demand to know that the forecast accuracy is there. This is a very important metric and must feed back into the equation, because we know how well we're tracking and whether we've got the right parameters to meet our customers' expectation. On the supply side, how frequently we can order or replenish, either from an internal supplier like our own factory or externally from another supplier. The lead time is an important variable. The order or lot size, and of course the delivery reliability, and managing and understanding how well our suppliers, both internal and external, are performing, is an extremely important component and can add a lot of complexity or difficulty into the equation. And it illustrates as well the point we made earlier, that it's important to have visibility up and down the supply chain so that you know how your suppliers are performing and they know what is happening upstream in your business. It can be fed back to them. All of these feed into what we call stock policy, which is really the rules that we want to set, which hopefully can be as dynamic and responsive as possible to how much stock we want to hold to meet the demand to the acceptable service level within the time frame the customer expects. And we need to be able to model those so that we can get inventory in the time phasing that we expect that demand to occur, because not all demand is flat and level. In fact, very seldom is it. And so we need to have that inventory available at the time that it's needed within the supply chain. So why does DIFOT fall short as a measure? Well, let's look at that as on the next slide. And this slide really illustrates that DIFOT really is the end metric. It's a very important and useful metric, but there are a whole host of contributing factors. Very often, as the graphic shows, inventory is used to cover up all these variables, like late deliveries, poor quality, large batch sizes, poor forecasting or planning, inadequate replenishment strategies. All of these things can be, to an extent, sometimes covered up by inventory, but those rocks lurking under the water, particularly when we attempt to improve efficiencies, as the next slide shows, and lower the levels of inventory, the ship of operations can come unstuck. And then it's very clear that it's not just one or two things that contribute, like how much inventory we have, to achieving a complex measure like DIFOT, we have to address all the underlying causes, and all the individuals and the processes in the business must work in conjunction to meet that end goal. So let's now switch to the next poll we've got, John, and ask our audience, which of the following is the biggest problem in your business? You want to talk to that?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Yep, absolutely. We'll throw that one up if we can. So as Simon said, which of the following is the biggest problem for your business? And we'll leave that one up on the screen for a moment. So again, we've been talking about today, DIFOT is definitely more of a problem than just something that needs to sit in the warehouse. And we might just about move on now, I think.
It's very interesting looking at the results as that poll comes in, John, to see that the predominant contributor there of nearly 60% is unexpected or a rush of sales orders. That's very interesting. So it's on the demand side that our customers are experiencing it more than the supply side.
Absolutely, and it segues very nicely into a point I'm just about to make. So, to shamelessly lift from Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, to make DIFOT a reality, we really need to begin with the end in mind. In this context, that means that sales needs to be performing their role with the goal of delivery on time and in full at the front of their mind, not just shifting units. Setting realistic customer expectations up front with regards to delivery time, providing realistic and timely feedback to purchasing, production, to the warehouse, informing them of what the upcoming demand patterns might look like. It's really important to have your sales team driving the outcomes that you've identified as desirable as well. From your regular Pareto analysis of your stock codes, we're going to be talking about this in a bit more detail soon. But that is to say, pushing the popular items and encouraging your clients to switch off the slow-moving items. So whilst it's fine to put all this in the lap of sales and say go out there and not just sell but do this for us as well, if you're really committed to achieving it, then you've got to put some tools in their hands to do it. And just as the factory needs to keep the plant equipment up to date, so too you need to keep the sales team equipment up to date. And the key tools that sales needs at hand to achieve this DIFOT goal is visibility in as near to real time as possible of stock levels, and in particular unallocated stock. So basically, what do we have available right now to ship, as well as tackle the promise times in the plant. So if the client orders today, given all the necessary lead times, the machine and staff constraints, when will we be able to start manufacturing and when will we be able to finish it? And of course, which items are to be pushed and which you need to be switching the clients off. Which of these metrics are the most important to you will certainly vary depending on what type of business you are. An engineer and make-to-order manufacturer is far more focused on capable-to-promise type analysis, whereas a fast-moving consumer goods company is very, very big on getting the forecast accuracy correct and being able to give the salespeople the tools to say what is in stock and when it will be in stock. One of the ways that progressive businesses are really addressing this is by pushing their ERP or whatever systems they have in the back office out to the point of activity and putting this information into the sales team's hands. The increasingly common way of doing this is to use things like tablets and smartphones, such as the ubiquitous iPad or iPhone, as well as, as is shown in the picture there, one of the many purpose-built devices that are specifically focused on mobile sales and these types of applications that have little keypads to make data entry easy, and just as importantly, if not more so, they're ruggedized to withstand the occasional accident, be it a coffee spill or a drop. These types of tools really ensure that your sales team, they not only have the information they need to hand, but they also reduce or eliminate lag. In order submission, they can provide additional CRM-related benefits in many cases. Of course, as I intimated, to get the benefit that you want from this type of solution, you've really got to make sure that the information is flowing to and from your back office systems in a timely, if not real-time fashion. Otherwise, you're simply introducing another opportunity for miscommunication and error. But in these days, these things, most modern systems have some sort of ability to put this information out in the hands of the staff at the point of activity. The other big way, of course, to put this kind of information in their hands is right at the start, before unrealistic demand has hit the business, is to have a customer-facing website. Now, again, this needs to be communicating with your ERP or the back-end system for it to be properly effective. However, there's a big risk that a lot of people don't perceive to this type of approach. And that is that for a number of businesses, particularly small and medium businesses, you can be exposing more information to the client than what you really want to have out there unfiltered. When you put this information in the hands of your sales professionals, they can, shall we say, filter the message. When you put it out there in an untended website environment, what you're showing to the customer is what you're committing to the customer, be that good or bad. So the same goes for when you put your manufacturing capacity out there. You know, it's possible to do these things, and in some cases, depending on the systems you're using in the back end, it's quite easy. But you need to consider how many of your business secrets do you want to expose to your customers, and how many do you want to filter to your customers. I guess at this point, I'm going to bring up another poll question. Does your business measure DIFOT? And while that one's up, I'm going to hand over to you, Simon, I guess, to continue this discussion.
Thank you, John. Yeah, it's interesting. Increasingly, we are seeing more and more companies measuring DIFOT. I don't know what you're experiencing in your business, but I see from the poll results coming up that it's still in the minority. It's about 40% of our respondents are saying that they measure DIFOT, but they don't measure DIFOT, they probably should. And only less than a quarter is saying that it's the top measure. So it's really such an important measure that we should be focusing more on. Hopefully after this, we'll see more people taking an interest in measuring throughout the business. So let's now start talking about one of the aspects, but it's not the only aspect, as we discussed before, which is why we must get inventory right. It's certainly a very important component, because ultimately it's the inventory that is the goods that the customer is expected to have. In its own right, inventory is a very important component because it's usually a very expensive asset. It's often the number 1 or 2 on the balance sheet, and optimization through forecasting improvements particularly allows us a better grasp on the demand. We can then get it right first time, but it has a second benefit, and that is allowing us to lower safety stock and therefore the overall holding, and get much more leanness and efficiency within our supply chain. Besides costing a lot to acquire in the first place, it's also a very expensive asset to maintain. Typically 20 to 30% in some of the customers that we work with around the world, up to 40% or more of the cost of inventory is the annual holding cost. So it's an asset that you want to make sure that it works efficiently and provides what it should provide, which is service to the customer. The third one is a no-brainer. It obviously affects service levels. And the whole goal of optimizing inventory is to improve service levels while reducing costs. And so those 20 to 30% typical reductions in inventory with an improvement in service level is entirely attainable, even though logically, as inventory is there to maintain service, you would think that in order to improve service, you need to push up inventory. But it's by getting that balance right, by getting all the variables around inventory, that all of which interact with the measurement and the delivery of DIFOT, that we get that process right. And finally, it's there to identify waste in the supply chain, and that must be part of the process. Inventory itself is one of the measures of waste, but it's often, and this was illustrated in that earlier graphic with the little ship floating in the sea, it's often the result of other forms of waste or inefficiency in the system, and that's the hidden cause that inventory can often lead you to, is improving the overall value of the benefit of your supply chain by attacking this one. So it's a very important and vital part of improving DIFOT is dealing with this complex process of getting your inventory right. So let's look now at how we can optimize inventory and improve its contribution. So even though it's a complex process, what I've tried to do, we seem to have skipped on a slide, maybe, there we go, thank you. Try to limit it down to 4 simple steps. And each of these steps has a lot within it, but let's just go through them quickly. The first one is to understand the importance and the behavior of stock codes in each location. Look at the demand patterns, look at how that stock code is contributing, look at the supply and other impact of that stock code. Because you may have stock codes which are not really contributing much in terms of sales value or margin, but are very important from a service point of view. So we need to understand the importance both, not only from a sales value or a profit component, but also from a service component. And also need to understand the behavior. Are these seasonal products? Are they erratic demand items? What are the characteristics of the demand patterns of that stock code? So you need to have ways to analyze this quickly and zone in so that you can identify and manage the stock codes in a way that's appropriate to both their importance and their behavior. Then very important is to get the best possible estimate of demand, get the forecast. And this is a process that everybody knows who's engaged with it. You get better at it as you go along. And you need to also understand what the benchmarks are, and John's going to talk a little bit more about benchmarks later, but the benchmarks are within your industry. What kind of forecast accuracy or forecast error are your competitors getting, that you're getting within your industry, so that you can see and track your performance amongst your peers. Then very important is to model that demand and look at the supply constraints. In other words, link this to the ability to supply, and this is a typical S&OP or sales and operation process, planning process, and then set the stock levels appropriate to your ability to meet that demand and within the constraints of your supply chain. And finally, having set the plan, we need to replenish timeously to the plan. So let's now look at a few of these variables in some more detail. So getting back to the first one, which is understand the importance and the behavior of stock codes, the way we do this is, one of the ways we do this is through a Pareto analysis, also known as an ABC analysis or a 80-20 rule. And typically, and this is a real customer example, that's where the 80-20 comes, 20% of the items are contributing 80% of the value. And that value may be sales value, it may be profitability, it may be the demands or hits that are occurring. You may get this very skewed. You may see only 2 or 3% of your products giving you 80% of the value. If you've got a very long tail, like in the spares industry or something like that. What we're seeing increasingly is that the tail of the Pareto, the C and D items, are becoming more and more, and there's more and more erratic behavior. So you need to have strategies, not only for managing those top A and B items, which are really often fast-moving, more easy to predict, where perhaps a lot of the value in the business is, but a lot of the perceived value from a customer's perception is also in the tail. So you need to have strategies to manage those items efficiently and effectively and to understand their behavior so you can manage them appropriately. In essence, you often need to have multiple supply chains through one physical supply chain. And this is really a logical supply chain in essence of how you're dealing with these different types of items within the business. So let's look at the next slide, and we can then identify, talk about how we get the best possible forecast. So here what we've got is a simple graphic showing 2 years of historical data. This is nice and repeating data we can see over the 2 years, and it's highly seasonal. And this is not that unusual. We'll look at a more real-life example a little bit later on, but what we do is fundamentally is we attempt to look at the patterns of the past and match those to different algorithms, and as shown by the dotted line, and then use that algorithm to predict the future. So we use the patterns of the past to predict the future. This works pretty well a lot of the time, not all the time, and that's why this whole process must be collaborative, because then those individuals, usually within the sales and marketing function, who understand and have their fingers on the pulse in the industry and in the economy, can then feedback and look at how these expected demand patterns may be changing or may be influenced by their activities or the activities of the customer or the activities of the economy. So let's look now on the next slide at a more realistic example. And very often when I show this slide to people, I say, describe that pattern of demand, they will say, it looks erratic, or it looks very difficult to forecast. They might even say, yes, there's some peaks in that demand, and it seems to be decreasing. When we look at, in the next slide, all 3 years, but that's showing a single year of demand. And this is real data taken from a customer of ours. We'll see that there are repeating patterns. You look at the 3 years shown by the different colors, there is definitely those patterns of demand, even though they're complex, are repeating. And if we could understand and manage those patterns and respond to them, we could do a much better job. Let's look briefly at the job that this customer was doing. Because of the complexity of the demand patterns, they were using an average, which is shown by that orange line through the middle, and they found that didn't work too well, so they had to put in lots of stock. And this is often a typical response to try and get service levels up. They were only getting 85% service level. They wanted 95. They were only getting 85% service level, even though they were holding on average 2.5 months of stock. So the stock turn performance wasn't great, 4.8 in a year, and their forecast accuracy was abysmal using an average. Although for some people 60% forecast accuracy is not bad, but in this instance they could have done a lot better. So what we did, as we show in the next slide, is we then used a more complex algorithm. And these screenshots are taken from Syspro of an actual situation. And you can see that that orange, thick orange line there is now showing a forecast that even just looking at, you'd say, yeah, that looks like a better forecast. It's matching those patterns of the past more accurately. Using that algorithm, we could improve our stock turn slightly from 4.8 to 6. The service level went up by 5%. The forecast accuracy went up to 90%, which is a good improvement. But we were still looking at quite a lot of stock holding. So we need to then look at what other steps we can take to improve that stock holding and perhaps further improve the service level, which are illustrated as we go along. So let's look now at the third step, which is how do we set appropriate stock levels to meet this demand, having linked this to our ability to supply, either from internal or external suppliers. So this is really the third question, the third step. What do we do about this demand? How much stock do we need to hold? And obviously, if you're looking at higher service levels and there's a lot of unpredictability in your supply chain, you need to hold more stock. And to do that, we need to understand the components of inventory. And as the slide is, which is hopefully building now on your screens, will show, there are 3 kinds of inventory. There's the safety or the buffer stock, which is the one that lowers the risk of stock outs and is there to find a balance between cost and service. Then there's the cycle stock, which lives on top of that. And that may have certain constraints like economic batch quantities or minimum order quantities. And finally, everything above that is excess. And the aim is to try and keep the stock between the minimum level, which is illustrated by the safety stock, and if John could just click, it will actually show us those levels. There they are, coming in there on the screen now, between the minimum and the maximum levels. And the average stock, which is, on average, we expect our stock to be, lives in between those. So these stock, when it's between the min and max, is in balance, otherwise it's out of balance. So now we can move on to the next slide, and we can see how we're going to graph that. There's the demand in the green curve there, and there we've set our min-max levels. Now we can flex those and balance those. We might reduce them and find out that the cost of holding stock reduces nicely, but the service is unacceptable. So we have to play around with those variables, as we saw with all those variables that we saw earlier on, the DIFOT variables, and until we find the right balance between inventory holding and the service level that we can or expect to produce. Now we can go on and see how doing this kind of exercise where we have time-phased inventory can make a big impact. There we've got that same demand pattern shown in green that we saw before, and then in red at the bottom is now setting that our min-max levels appropriate to those dynamic demand patterns. We can, using tools such as Syspro has, we can get a big benefit in terms of our overall stock holding. And then you can see the final outcome there is the average stock holding now has gone down to 1.2 months. The stock turns have gone from 4.8 to 10.2, and we're now looking at achieving the target service level of 95% while maintaining forecast accuracy. So this shows how the complexities in inventory can be managed effectively and can contribute enormously towards achieving DIFOT. And then finally, as the last screenshot shows, on the next slide, we can see how important it is in that fourth step to replenish time estimate to plan. We've got this plan, we've got now dynamic stock levels we can maintain into the future, we've got good forecasts, but we have to maintain to the plan. We've got to keep to the plan. And so often this leg is ignored or not given the importance that it needs to have. So here we can see that from that graphic that MRP must then, or whatever tool we're using for replenish, must then follow. And in the screenshot here that John has put up, we can see that the demand and supply patterns are being matched so that we're holding our min-max levels, we're holding our stock, our target inventory is following the expected demand patterns, so we can maintain levels of inventory appropriate to the demand that we're expecting to have in the time frames that it's occurring. So I'll turn over to you now, John, and you can talk about some of the issues around getting the warehouse the right kind of chance to meet its end of the bargain.
Thanks, Simon. It's really important to understand too, just to speak to what Simon was saying there, that a good system, and not to be too subtle, but a system like Syspro can take a lot of the mathematical crunching that's involved in the stuff that Simon was showing there and turn it into a click of a button to be able to dynamically set your inventory levels based on your stock policy, to be able to match various forecasting formula and to compare them against each other in order to identify which one moves forward. Your good systems can really take what is an incredibly onerous mathematical requirement and reduce it down to a click or two. Now, moving on, as we've mentioned earlier, and I guess we've shown so far, DIFOT's not solely the responsibility of the warehouse, or at least probably shouldn't be solely the responsibility of the warehouse. But that being said, the warehouse does definitely have a part to play, and depending on your business model, that part can be actually very, very significant. So, to paraphrase Sean Connery from The Untouchables, don't bring a knife to a gunfight. But it's also important to not use a cannon to crack a walnut. Different businesses, they really need different tools in their warehouse. If you're a make-to-order or an engineer-to-order style business, then you've got small raw material stocks or maybe even a smaller finished goods warehouse. What makes sense for you to equip the warehouse with, it's going to be radically different from what the team inside of a dedicated distribution centre or even a cross-dock, what they not just want, but what they really vitally need to execute their business. Commonly, it's going to come down to the volume of goods, both in raw materials and finished goods, as well as the value those goods represent individually and collectively, and I guess the quality controls that need to be put on the delivery of, again, either your raw materials or your finished goods. So the controls around the movement of nuts and bolts, they're going to differ from the controls you have to put around the movements of, shall we say, highly disposable, high-value sporting equipment, or pharmaceutical goods, again, either raw materials or finished product. And whilst there's a host of ways to drive the warehouse ever harder, nearly all of them are best enabled with some manner of technology designed to improve speed, eliminate errors, and just as importantly, to eliminate complexity and reduce learning time of the warehouse staff. So I'm going to take a look at some of the automatic identification technologies that you can put out to the warehouse, and also some of the mobile computing tools that allow you to leverage those technologies. And probably the most famous one out there is the barcode. On June 26th, 1974, it was, the first barcode ever used in a commercial application was scanned, and that 10-pack of Wrigley's gum is actually now in the Smithsonian Institute over in the States. For all of us nowadays, barcoding is really nothing new, but it is a technology that is sometimes a bit obscure to people of how it actually works beyond some lines appear on a piece of paper, and I scan them with a laser beam. Barcodes are at heart, they're simply another form of written language, just like English, French or Malay. The big difference is that barcodes, they're a language designed for machines to be able to read easily. It's possible for people with too much time on their hands to learn how to read barcodes without using the human readable numbers underneath, I don't recommend it as a hobby, but it's possible, and there was a time in my life when, given some study, I could read a few of the symbologies without a guide. Which leads me into a term, symbologies. Just like other languages, barcodes have dialects, different ways of saying the same thing, and these are called symbologies. The most common symbologies out there, or some of the most common, are interleave 2 of 5, code 128, and the ones that we hear in the supply chain most often, EAN 13 and EAN 128. Each of these uses a mixture of narrow and thick bars of light and dark, and note that even though usually they don't have to be black and white, to encode what can indeed be the full ASCII character set at times, not just numbers. You can put question marks in some barcodes. Usually, though, barcodes are just some form of a license plate. They're a series of numbers that link back at a database level to your back-end system, whatever it may be, in order to explain what they're stuck onto. The most common of this is what you see down the bottom, an EAN 13 barcode, used on just about every retail product in the world. EAN 13, or used to be known as, also sometimes known as UPC, stands for European Article Numbering, or Universal Product Code. It's a 13-digit barcode that's monitored by a global standards organisation called GS1, and it's a formalised license plate. So if you look at the one at the bottom, the 93 at the start indicates the country of origin, 93 being Australia in this case. The next 5 digits, 10779, are unique identifiers to the company that's responsible for creating this barcode, and they're again monitored and distributed out by GS1. The final, or the next 5, 3 and 4 zeros in this case, are a unique product code. So now you've got country, company and product identified by GS1, stored in a database that they can share. And the final digit there is 5, is just a check digit to make sure that when the rest of those numbers are scanned, that everything's worked correctly. So you can see a barcode really is just a type of license plate, and if you want to share it with up and down your supply chain, then you might need to talk to someone like GS1 to help you to put that database out there. But if you just want to use it internally, you can print your own, encode whatever you want, and use whatever you want. So they can be used, quite effectively throughout the whole supply chain, manufacturing and distribution. There's some examples on the side there of 2-dimensional barcodes. These are not that new technology, but they're starting to gain mainstream acceptance. 2D barcodes are basically a bunch of normal barcodes stacked on top of each other. One of the key tricks to them is that obviously they store in massively more information, but you need special barcode readers to scan them, particularly images, which are basically a form of camera, and hence a lot of people nowadays are taking photos of these with their digital phones, which decode them and deals with the data somehow. Very quickly, a couple of things to be aware of with barcodes. They're very ubiquitous out there, but they do have some limitations. They don't work particularly well in sunlight because they're based on contrast. Weathering can, of course, reduce that contrast. And range of scanning, and line of sight's definitely obviously needed, and range of scanning is a question. But a lot of people don't understand that with the right barcodes, I've seen barcodes scanned consistently in sunlight, in fact, at ranges of 12 and 15 metres, but you need the right combination of scanner and barcode label. It's also possible to put barcode scanners on conveyor belts, so that, distribution centre environment, things as they track down the belt. And it's also possible to put omnidirectional scanners, like you see at the supermarket counter, on trolleys so that you can pick to multiple totes. Another technology that's out there that's very popular, and I'm aware that we're starting to run against the time here, is RFID. In 2001, a colleague of mine described RFID as the oldest emerging technology in the world. RFID was patented for most of the uses to which it's put today, at almost exactly the same time that barcodes entered the first commercial use, something like 40 years ago. But even today, it remains very much a niche solution. Over a long career in this type of industry, one of the things that I've frequently seen when people start talking about RFID, I found it useful to ask them the question, why not barcodes? And sometimes they have a very good answer, but sometimes the answer boils down to a misunderstanding of either what RFID can do or what barcodes can do. Sometimes I've seen RFID projects at the simple ask of that question become barcode projects, and sometimes I've seen them graduate to things like voice picking projects as well. At heart, RFID boils down to really being about the tags and the readers, and both of the decisions require thought. At the tag side of things, there's frequency and standards. The EPC standard is one that's very popular out there, and the frequencies that they operate in. It also comes down to the memory you need on your tag, whether you want to use them as, again, just a license plate, or whether you want to use them to store detailed information on the movement, the history, the temperatures that the item has been involved with. A question of range, from feet to many, many metres as possible, and a question of environment. You know, do I want to put this, what do I want to stick it onto? Metal, wood, is it going to be indoor or out? Which leads, of course, to the final question when it comes to the tag of form factor, I guess, which is, does it need to be reusable? Does it need to be rugged? Does it need to be invisible? As shown in the corner there, it's quite conceivable to stick an RFID tag on the back of what looks like a standard barcode tag, and that's often used in security applications too. Barcode readers, you know, there's a whole host of them out there, but they come down again to where do you want to use it. And in a warehousing and distribution centre sense, the common uses are around the dock door or a portal, and there are readers that can surround that with the intention that you can drive an entire pallet through and just scan it. The practical reality of this is that you can scan a license plate type environment, but it's much more difficult to scan individual products. You can get handheld RFID readers that basically replace a handheld barcode reader. You can get conveyor belt RFID readers that do the same. There are some RFID readers specifically designed to mount on forklifts so that drivers can pick up a pallet, instantly know which one they've got and where it needs to go. There are overhead RFID readers designed to sit over the stretch wrap station. Again, there's another one so that you can quickly see what you're looking at. One of the big challenges with RFID, though, comes down to cost. RFID is between 5 cents and in some cases many, many dollars. It's not the essentially free that barcoding is, and in many cases that's enough to stillborn an RFID project right there. Speak quickly about a couple of other emerging emerging auto ID technologies in the warehouse, and that's voice picking and pick to light. Voice picking is hands-free, eyes-free. There's a lot of really interesting opportunities there with that. The reality is that it's most commonly used in cold stores, that type of thing, and for picking bulky goods where you do need a two-hand type environment. It can be expensive, it can be complicated, it certainly needs a lot of software, but it is a reasonably effective technology these days. Pick to light is another technology that's out there, another one that's potentially very expensive, and one of the challenges is that it can be very hard to move around, but extremely useful where you've got pick-to-tote type environments, many small items going into a tote, into one order. All of these, of course, need to come back to, well, not all of them, but most of them need to come back to some sort of point of computing tool, and there's a host of them out there from a host of different manufacturers. The key things to keep in mind are, do I need them real time? And commonly the answer is yes. In that case, you need RF, or as we more commonly know it now, just wireless networking. But you can batch download them and just, like synchronizing your iPod, just send a file backwards and forwards. They're also rugged so that you can drop them onto concrete, you can hose them, you can use them in all kinds of the dirty end of the supply chain type applications. So again, aware of time, we've skipped through that one a little bit. Simon, do you want to say just a couple of words on the point of what you don't measure doesn't matter?
Okay, thanks, John. It's, in fact, this is a well understood phrase that if you don't measure it, you don't manage to it. So it's very important that not only we have all these components and these variables in there, but we're measuring them, we're making them visible, as you've emphasized previously, so that all the collaborative components within the business can see them and respond to them. So it's an extremely important part of that, is having the visibility. So some of these are actual versus scheduled deliveries, full or partial deliveries, all these metrics that some businesses have, which are very common, and being able to segment them down by customer or product or branch or region so that you can zone in and make sure that you're covering all the bases in terms of all the different areas and components of the business. Certainly forecast accuracy is a very important metric, and we talked a little bit about how that one goes back into utilizing or setting up a safety stock or buffer stock within the system like Syspro. The Pareto analysis we've emphasized, and obviously too, a very important one, and I'm seeing that there's not a lot out there, I don't know about your experience, John, but proper analysis of supplier performance, really understanding where your suppliers, both internal and external, are coming to the party and where they're falling off the radar. And definitely a stock out analysis, being able to track lost sales, and not only lost sales, but stock outs, where you've got stock outs, and being able to hone in on the reasons for that so that you can hopefully rectify them in the future. So
I
John,
guess,
would you like to?
Yeah, I might seek to tie it all together, and we promised 7 habits of highly effective DIFOT, so to speak. So as we said, begin with the end in mind. Take control of your demand patterns by having sales set realistic expectations, and that goes both with the customer and internally. It's important not just to say to the customer, we can't deliver in these types of timeframes, but also to say to the internally, we have to deliver in these types of timeframes. The next habit you need to get into is, as Simon has said, understand what stock is important to you and how it behaves, and that's that Pareto type analysis. Moving from there, you've got to get the best possible estimate of demand. You must forecast, and you must really be looking at that forecast over and over again, because that's what really allows you to do the next step. Prioritise, plan, and execute your manufacturing and your purchasing schedules. This is at the heart of delivering, your DIFOT requirements, but it's so dependent on getting the steps before it accurate. From there, once you've got it into the warehouse on time, you've got to get out of there in time, and so give the warehouse the weapons that it needs to fight. And finally, again, to lift from the 7 habits of highly effective people, sharpen the saw. You need to really actively be studying your Pareto analysis. You need to actively be reviewing your forecast accuracy, regularly examining your min-maxes, not just quarterly. For some businesses, that should be almost a weekly requirement that you're forecasting out and adjusting your min-max levels. And be critical of your suppliers. We didn't get the opportunity today to speak in as much detail as we might have liked about working on the supplier side, but everything we've said here, you can push back onto your suppliers and demand of them as well. The 7th habit, of course, is to understand that DIFOT's an outcome and not a goal. 100% DIFOT's no harder than 0% DIFOT. For either figure, just set your inventory to the level you need, and you get the outcome that you've chosen. But as we've demonstrated, if you use your DIFOT measurements to show how well the rest of the business is working, following that 6th habit of continually sharpening the saw, then you can chip away at your inventory, get it lower, 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 but keep your DIFOT up there where it needs to be. And Simon showed a real-life example that we'd be happy to talk about in more detail of how we did that for a client. So as we come to the end, I mentioned that we did for a client. We is Syspro software. Syspro is one of the largest ERP vendors in the world. We have offices in most of the countries in the world and resellers through most of the places that we're not directly. We have both on-premises and cloud-based SaaS solutions, and Syspro is very much focused at the dirty end of the supply chain, manufacturing and distribution organisations, and I hope that we've demonstrated some of our expertise in there. So at this point, we might say thank you to Simon and take a look at some of the questions we've got submitted. And one of the first ones we've got is one that I should have been very clear on up the front, which is, can we have a copy of the presentation? Now, certainly we'll be distributing a copy of that at the end of today's presentation to those who want to log in. So that will be available at the end. What other questions do we have here? There's a reasonable one here that I see from presumably a Syspro client. Does Syspro have a mobile solution? Well, yes, we do. It's a multi-phase question. We can do it a number of different ways, the same way that there are different requirements that you've got for what you want to do with mobility. There are a number of different ways that Syspro can work with a mobile solution. But they're all out there, including predefined packages that we have fully integrated. So can you see any there, Simon?
Yes, also one along those lines, how easy is it to integrate external warehouse systems and the like with Syspro, where people have existing warehouse systems? Would you like to talk to that, John?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good point. There are two approaches to that. Obviously, Syspro has a full inventory management and warehouse management system. However, in many cases, people have existing systems that they need to integrate into Syspro. Syspro is built upon a technology of web services, a service-oriented architecture, and it's a comparatively straightforward process to bring data in and out of Syspro whilst maintaining the integrity of your business rules. It's very easy for systems to just import and export files straight to the database. Syspro takes a slightly more advanced approach to this and imports and exports those data whilst running through all of the business processes and business rules that make sure that you're getting the right data in and out. It's an important distinction. But that being said, of course, Syspro has fully integrated inventory optimization, warehouse management, and inventory management solutions as part of its suite of modules. Look, unfortunately, we've run a little bit over time today, so we probably don't have a lot of time for any other questions, unless there's something pressing that you want to fire, Simon?
No, I don't see any other questions coming through as well at this time, so I'm good on my side, John. Thank you for inviting me to participate, and I hope our audience got value from the webinar.
Yeah, thank you, Simon, and thank you, everybody. Please feel free to submit questions to via the link that sent you this email, and either Simon or myself will be more than happy to elaborate on what we said today. Thank you, everybody.